There are moments in history where destruction doesn't leave noise behind. It leaves silence. Cities that once carried trade, voices, and movement that reduced to stillness. Not slowly, not over generations, but suddenly. Travelers arrived expecting life and found empty streets, markets abandoned, doors left open, structures still standing, but without purpose. No battle happening, no resistance in progress, just the result already finished. And what made this even more unsettling was that this wasn't one place. It was happening across regions, different cultures, different empires, same outcome. Word began to spread faster than armies. Stories moved ahead of something approaching, something that didn't behave like normal war, because in many cases, by the time it arrived, the decision had already been made. Some fought, some fled, some surrendered without ever seeing the enemy. And behind this pattern, behind the speed, behind the fear that moved ahead of reality, that was one man. The man behind this expansion was not born into power. Genghis Khan, known at birth as Temujin, came from a world where control was unstable and survival was never guaranteed. His father had been a leader, but after his death, that position did not protect the family. Instead, everything collapsed. Allies left. Protection disappeared. Even their own group abandoned them. What remained was not influence, but survival. Food had to be found, not given. Trust had to be earned, not assumed. In this environment, Temujin learned something early. Power is not permanent. It can disappear suddenly, and once it is gone, everything else follows. During his early life, he faced direct conflict within this system. He was captured by a rival group, reduced to someone without control, but he escaped, and that moment mattered, because it changed how he understood the world. He did not see it as stable. He saw it as something that could be taken, lost, and taken again. So instead of waiting for power, he began building it, slowly, by gathering people who chose to follow him. Not because they had to, but because he proved he could survive. And from that small beginning, something larger started forming. Before any empire could exist, the steppe had to change, and that meant confronting the reality of how power worked there. The Mongolian steppe was not united. It was divided into tribes, each with its own leader, its own alliances, and its own conflicts. Among the strongest were groups like the Merkits, the Tatars, and the Naimans. These were not weak opponents. They controlled territory, they had fighters, they had influence, and most importantly, they had history. Conflicts between these groups were constant. Alliances formed and broke depending on survival. There was no lasting order. What Genghis Khan did was step directly into this instability. He didn't avoid it, he used it. When conflict happened, he didn't just aim to win temporarily. He aimed to remove opposition completely. When he defeated a rival group, he didn't leave them separate, he absorbed them. Their fighters became part of his force. Their structure disappeared into his. This did two things at once, that it made him stronger, and it made future resistance weaker. Step by step, tribe by tribe, this pattern continued. Enemies became followers. Opposition became reinforcement. But this wasn't just about fighting. It was about control, because once groups were brought in, they were reorganized. Old loyalties were broken, new ones were created, and over time, something new began to exist. Not separate tribes, but a unified force. By 1206, this transformation reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. Temujin was given a new title, Genghis Khan. This was not just recognition. It was confirmation that the steppe, once divided, that was now under a single authority. And once that unity was achieved, there was only one direction left to move: outward. With the steppe unified, the next question was no longer about control. It was about expansion. And expansion meant facing something different. Not tribes, but states. Organized systems with cities, defenses, and structure. One of the first major targets was the Western Xia dynasty. This was not open land. It was a structured kingdom with fortified positions and established leadership. For the first time, Genghis Khan's forces had to operate beyond the environment they understood best. This was a test, not just of strength, but of adaptability. Instead of relying on a single decisive battle, the approach was controlled pressure, movement, engagement, withdrawal, return. Over time, this created strain on the defending system. Eventually, Western Xia submitted. This was important. Because it proved something new. The unified force from the steppe could defeat an organized state. But that was only the beginning. The next major challenge was far larger, the Jin dynasty in northern China. This was not a small kingdom. It controlled major cities, large populations, and had established military defenses. Direct confrontation alone would not be enough, so the strategy evolved. Instead of attacking everything at once, pressure was applied over time. Key areas were targeted, supply systems were disrupted, movement was controlled, progress was not instant, but it was consistent. And with each success, experience grew, because these wars were not just victories. They were preparation. Preparation for something much larger, because beyond these first campaigns lay empires that would test the system at its highest level. After the early wars proved that organized states could be defeated, expansion entered a different phase. This was no longer testing. This was execution. The most defining campaign began with a conflict that did not start as war, but became one. The Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia was a powerful state controlling major trade routes and cities. At first, contact came through trade and diplomacy. But when those interactions broke down, when envoys were mistreated and trust collapsed, the response was not limited. It was decisive. Genghis Khan did not move as a single advancing force. Instead, he divided his army into multiple units. Each unit moved across different routes at the same time. This created a situation where pressure was not focused in one direction. It was everywhere. Cities could not rely on a single defensive line. Because there was no single front, key cities became targets, not randomly, but strategically. Bukhara, a center of culture and trade, when it fell, it sent a message not just to one region, but to many. Then came Samarkand, larger, more fortified, more prepared. But preparation did not change the outcome, because the pattern was already working. Movement, coordination, pressure from multiple directions. Defenses weakened not just from force, but from the inability to respond effectively. After Central Asia, the expansion did not slow. It extended into Persia, then further west, toward regions that had not yet faced anything like this. And each time, the same effect followed. Point one victory did not end the campaign. It opened the next, and that is what made this phase different. It was not a series of disconnected wars. It was a continuous chain, each conquest feeding into the next. Each success increasing both capability and reputation. And as that reputation spread, something important began to happen. The war was no longer only fought on the battlefield. It was being decided before armies even arrived. By this point, the question was no longer whether expansion would continue, but why it was so difficult to stop. The answer was not a single factor. It was how several advantages worked together. First, movement. Mongol forces could travel faster and further than many of their opponents expected. This allowed them to choose when and where to engage. Second, coordination. Instead of relying on one large force, multiple units operated at the same time. This created pressure across different areas simultaneously. Defending against one attack was difficult. Defending against several at once, that much harder. Third, information. Before entering a region, knowledge about that region had already been gathered. This reduced uncertainty and improved decision-making. But the most influential factor was perception. By now, news of earlier campaigns had spread widely. Regions knew what had happened elsewhere, so when forces approached, decisions were influenced before any direct conflict began. Some chose resistance. Others chose surrender, not because they lacked strength, but because they understood the pattern. And once decisions begin to change before action, the outcome becomes harder to reverse. That is why stopping this expansion was not only a military challenge, it was a psychological one. By the end of his life, Genghis Khan had built something that did not exist before, an empire that stretched across vast parts of Asia, not through a single campaign, but through continuous expansion, built step by step. Regions that had once operated independently were now connected under one structure. Trade routes shifted. Political systems changed. Control moved from local to centralized authority. This created new forms of connection between distant areas, but it also brought disruption. Because expansion at that scale does not happen without consequence. Cities changed, populations moved, systems were replaced, The impact was not the same everywhere, but the transformation was consistent, and this is what defines his legacy. Not only the size of what was built, but the way it was built. Through movement, through control, through a sequence of decisions that turned small beginnings into large outcomes. And that leaves a question. When power grows to this level, is it defined by what it creates or by what it changes? If you want more stories like this, real history, real power, real decisions that shape the world, subscribe, because this is only one story.